Episode 85, The Long Goodbye by Raymond Chandler. And welcome to Point Blank. It's me, Kurt. I'm back for an episode, and joining me as always, here's Justin.
Hey everybody. Hey Kurt. Welcome back. It's good to hear from you again on Point Blank. It's been a little bit of time.
It has been a while. Sorry to longtime listeners. It's been a long time since we've done an episode, but we wanted to get back together. What is going to be our last episode? We have saved The Long Goodbye to say goodbye.
While we didn't start the series with Chandler, he was one of our first reads. We read The Big Sleep, I think, in episode 3. And Raymond Chandler was the author who got me first into classic hard-boiled and detective fiction. So I think it's appropriate to spend some time with one of his late works and see how it resonates with us on our way out the door.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to end with Chandler. I mean, I think Chandler is the name that comes to mind when thinking about this genre, and his work is probably, and we'll talk about this more later, I think, but it's also the work that's probably going to stand the test of time, and people, for as long as people are doing literature of the 20th century, they will probably be covering Raymond Chandler's work. First of all, before we get into the book, I wanted to thank you, Justin, for doing your 10 episode arc of writing Rat Face. I hope that writers learned something from it, and I hope that readers also learned a little bit more about the writing process. So thank you very much for doing those episodes while I was busy trying to complete grad school.
Oh, no worries. It was fun. I hope that if folks didn't learn from it, they at least learn what not to do. And I hope it didn't hurt your writing. That would make me satisfied. I don't want to do any damage, but it was a fun project, and it helped to get me through some difficult times during my heal from heart surgery. But here we are back with reading a shared common work, an important one, and one that I haven't read in many, many years. So it was kind of interesting to revisit.
Same thing for me. I read this years ago before we were even thinking about this podcast, and I hadn't really touched it for a long period of time. So with a different ear, a different eye, because I read and listened to this book, it was interesting to revisit it and just see what was good and what was not so good in The Long Goodbye. But before we get into our in-depth analysis, Justin, would you like to give us a summary of the book?
Yes, I didn't write down a detailed summary for this book. It's going to be a little bit of an impressionist painting. It is a convoluted book. It's a complicated plot,
Yes.
especially for Chandler, who, let's just put it this way. Chandler was never a plot genius. He was a guy that stitched together various plots to serve the needs of publishers. The Big Sleep most certainly suffered from this, and we actually mentioned it during our episode of The Big Sleep. The Long Goodbye also has this kind of hodgepodge approach to plotting, but let's talk about kind of what happens in this story. It's considered one of his best works. He didn't write that many books, but this one by some is argued to be up there with Farewell My Lovely and The Big Sleep. And we'll talk about whether or not we think that that's earned or not. But this came out in 1953, a post-war book. It won the Edgar Award in 1955, so it did get acclaim even when he was still around and writing. And it is obviously late. It's in the twilight of his career, and we get a more mature Chandler writing about Marlowe, which I think is always a cool thing to see. I love when writers revisit a character they came to know when they were younger and spend time with them and get to know them as that author themselves is undergoing and experiencing difficult situations in their own life. How much of that gets imparted on the character? As you'll see, quite a bit, I would argue. But here's what happens in the story, bare bones edition. We have Philip Marlowe. He meets this guy named Terry Lennox. Terry Lennox has spent some time in England and has some scars on his face, and he's just totally ripping drunk. And Marlowe has an interesting affection for him. They just hit it off. They have some kind of kismet, some kind of chemistry, and they become pals. So one of their ways of being friends is, they end up making this kind of regular meetup to have gimlets and talk about stuff. And the first, maybe 10% of the book is kind of dedicated to this Marlowe Lennox almost love story. They're just like friends, and it's so confusing because we don't think of Marlowe as somebody who's touchable, who's approachable, who has the ability to make connections in this kind of way. So we're seeing a different aspect of his character. They have ups and downs in their friendship as we see Marlowe kind of be a little bit nostalgic and is kind of sputtering at the beginning of this book. At a certain point, Lennox reappears in a panic. He seeks Marlowe's help. Something's gone wrong. He does have a rich wife, and it's questionable whether there's any genuine love in that relationship. But ultimately, Lennox seeks Marlowe's help because something has gone wrong. We don't know what it is, but we do know that Lennox needs Marlowe to help him escape to Mexico. And Marlowe agrees to help him without any questions, really. And the only thing he doesn't want to know is what happened. He wants to be sort of protected from that knowledge. So Marlowe drops Lennox off in Mexico, says goodbye. Later learns that Lennox's wife Sylvia has been murdered. And of course, this murder is like one of the major motors of the story. It gets the plot going, and a lot of things emerge in the wake of this murder. The cops arrest Marlowe pretty much immediately and rough him up, assuming that he has something to do with it. He's hiding evidence. He knows where Lennox is. Marlowe doesn't reveal anything. We get some nice sequences with him, smart talking with the cops. We get some nice insights into his character. Some classic Marlowe dialogue happens during this time. But then he's released. Why is he released? Because Lennox is found in Mexico dead. He's committed suicide. He leaves a full confession. It's clearly an open and shut case. He killed his wife and he is dead, and there's nothing really to worry about here. So that's how it seems. That's how the cops think of it. Marlowe, of course, isn't so sure. And the rest of the novel, which is long as hell by Chandler standards, like the next 400 to 450 pages are kind of unraveling this initial situation. So it's a slow burn story. We'll talk about that. Kind of a second narrative happens after this. It's one about this alcoholic writer named Roger Wade. Chandler is visited by a publisher named Spencer, who needs Wade to get his latest novel done, but Wade is an alcoholic and he's unstable and he's gone missing. So this publisher wants Marlowe to go find Wade, and Marlowe says no at first, but then the wife of this author, Wade's wife is named Eileen. She visits and persuades Marlowe to take on the case, and he agrees this time. Flash forward a little bit, and we have Marlowe figuring out that he's got to be with some kind of doctor with the last name that starts with V. He narrows down the list of doctors that fit that criteria and finds him at Dr. Varinger's Ad Hoc Detox Ranch in the hills, some kind of off the official lists detox facility for I guess alcoholic writers and their ilk. It's a weird situation, but anyway, he finds Wade, gets him home. Eileen Wade hires Marlowe to babysit Roger in order to get his his book done. They live in the fancy country club style house. They have a bunch of rich friends. We get to see this hoi poi kind of lifestyle happening for a large bit of the story. Marlowe leaves at one point, runs into Miss Loring, who's Sylvia Lennox's sister, in a bar. They talk about Terry Lennox. Things start to come together in weird ways. Lennox is familiar with these people because his wife is tied to this sort of hoi poi set of country club folk. At a party, Linda's husband, Dr. Edward Loring, threatens Wade over Wade's behavior with Linda. There's a lot of kind of infighting and sexual tension amongst these kind of pathetic, bored rich people. Later on, Marlowe's called to the Wades again because Roger's drunk. Roger's outside with a head wound. We see that Roger owns a gun. Roger gets to sleep, and then Marlowe's almost seduced by Eileen. There's a lot of this kind of domestic drama unfolding, and it's around this part of the story I started to wonder, what the hell is the story about? What is Chandler doing here? But ultimately, we get the sense that Eileen knows more than she lets on. Roger's drinking maybe not just because of his writing issues, but because he knows some uncomfortable secrets as well. We learned that Eileen has had a lover during World War II who went by the name of Paul Marston. And then later we learned that Terry Lennox also has gone by Paul Marston. And we start to see, oh my God, these things are all connected. Marlowe is invited at one point to the Wades later on, where Roger gets drunk. When Marlowe's outside, there's a gunshot. He comes back inside and finds that Roger has committed suicide, another suicide. Was it a suicide though, or not? And that's the question. We get in a situation where Eileen comes in and accuses Marlowe, but the cops ultimately don't believe that line. Um, we have Marlowe and Spencer visiting Eileen and poking holes in her case, and ultimately it turns out that Eileen is the one who is sort of wrapped up in the Sylvia Lennox thing and the Roger Wade killing because they were having an affair together. At this point, we're like, holy shit, there's a lot going on in this novel. How do we bring it back to the original situation? How do we bring it back to Terry? Should I reveal the ending at this point, Kurt? Do you think I should be straight with that here?
I think, considering the age of this novel, I think we can go ahead and spoil the ending. But if listeners, you don't want that spoiled, pause now and go read the good long goodbye.
Yes, open your window, jump out, and then come back after about 3 minutes, and we should be good. So at the end, all this shit's happening. You see all these weird connections, a bunch of sad alcoholics killing each other and sleeping with each other. But ultimately, this question of Terry Lennox, how much was he a part of this? How much was he connected to this series of crimes? Well, we assume he's dead. At the end of the story, after all the dust has settled, and I'm skipping certain plot threads. I'm skipping the issue with Menendez for the sake of getting to the end of this weird, uncomfortable summary. At the end, Philip Marlowe gets a hunch, and ultimately he's correct. He has a visitor toward the end of the story at his office. It's a guy who's come from Mexico. He's saying that he was a witness to Terry Lennox's murder, or I'm sorry, suicide. He saw it all. He was in the room, and Marlowe kind of asked some questions about it, but you can tell that Marlowe's not totally buying it. And ultimately, during their exchange, Marlowe says, I don't believe you. I know that you weren't somebody who came into the room because you were already in the room. You're Terry Lennox. And he's right. Terry Lennox has had plastic surgery with the help of his gangster buddies. He pretty much faked his own death and just got out of town because of the shit going down with his wife. He wasn't the murderer, but he was somebody who kind of he knew that Eileen had been the murderer, and he just wanted to get out of town. And he took this sort of moment as an opportunity for him to make a change in his life. Marlowe, this doesn't sit well with him. The whole thing just feels weird to him, like some kind of moral questions arise in him. He doesn't think that Terry's the man he thought he was. And he ultimately allows Terry, he says, I'm not going to, we're not continuing this friendship essentially. And Terry walks off kind of disappointed. And that's the end of the story. It's sort of this ambiguous, like, I'm not into this morally bankrupt figure. And Marlowe sort of holds his own in a way that's, I don't know, kind of sad, kind of bittersweet. Like the ending of the show. Um, Ultimately, this is a complex web of intrigue. There are so many layers and threads. I think it's a complicated work. Is it a great work? I would say some of it is great. Some of it is less than great. I would probably give it a 3.75 hits for a book of this stature. I guess that's a little bit underwhelming. I don't know. That's where I'm at with it. It's a weird one, but I didn't dislike it at all. Convoluted.
Yeah, convoluted is right, Justin. I thank you for the summary. I'm I'm hesitant to rate this one just because as I've taken a little bit of time away from the show, I sort of am thinking about like, is this a if you're trying to understand crime fiction, should you read this book? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. I think you have to understand Raymond Chandler. You have to look at this book and you have to look at it through that lens. And so with that said, yeah, I think this is convoluted. I know some people really enjoy this book, and I think, like you said, it has moments of brilliance. It has some set pieces that really shine, and Chandler's words and ability to create those little pieces are excellent. But as a whole, it's really kind of a mess. There's just so many tangents in the middle of the story that it did feel like Chandler was trying to say a whole bunch of different things and putting them into one book.
Mm-hmm.
And reviewers and critics look at this as, they'll say this is the most personal work. And it's sort of like, well, no
Yeah.
shit. Um, it's,
Mm-hmm.
one of our main plot threads is about an author, and I didn't mention it, but I heard it. You made a slip of the tongue, which I thought was perfect. You referred to Wade as Chandler being contacted by his publisher. Um,
That's funny.
Yes, and it's such a clear stand-in, someone who's dealing with being insecure about their legacy and ability, and the alcoholism, frankly, as we know from
Yeah.
our previous episodes on Chandler, was a major issue for him in his life. It's a book that should be read with a lot of caveats, I think,
Sure.
but I enjoyed it. I mean, I've been through the book at least 3 times, maybe 4 times at this point. I can't remember, but it's enjoyable. It's just that for me, the book, about the first half of the book is fine, and then the last like 10%, 10 to 15% maybe. But it's that in between part there where it's like, oh my gosh, let's get rid of all of these like very convenient connections.
The levels of convenience in this book were there were numerous examples I noted in my writings, where things just happened that were too damn convenient, and maybe a more careful or more astute writer would have in the editing process sort of made note of that, but I did have a problem with the saggy 300 pages in the middle where the book almost lost me. I have notes sort of like on page 128. I write, I'm kind of wondering about the pacing of this book. We meet Terry Lennox, we lose Terry Lennox. Marlowe's interrogated. He gets invited to a hangout with a publisher. Now he's babysitting an alcoholic writer, and I'm just like, what is this book? And Chandler, not only is he suffering through advanced alcoholism at this point in his middle ages, he does have doubts about his writing. If you may recall, he aspired to be a literary writer. He wasn't aiming for Black Mask when he started. He had larger ambitions, and he has all this weird stuff wrapped up in knights and chivalry that we see in this book. But also, his wife was dying.
Oh
His wife
yes,
was
yeah.
severely ill, and she was in decline while he was writing this book. And I think maybe there some of the a lot of the sentimentality and the thick nostalgia, it might be tied to some of the emotions he was experiencing as Sissy was in decline.
Yeah, there's a real sense, and I'd like to touch on this again in a couple of minutes, but a real sense of futility in this book, and just felt a little, at times it felt a little more existential than some of Chandler's other work.
I would agree.
A lot of ways, that's for me what actually saves the book and makes it shine, because it does feel reflective of, and I guess I'm already getting into my larger comment here, but it does sort of get reflective of the genre as a whole, and sometimes the it just repeats, things just repeat themselves, or a missing person was dead all along, or in this case, someone who was dead wasn't dead all along, but other people became dead in the process, and it's just a mess upon a mess. And Marlowe is the witness to it all.
Yeah. That's true. And I think that there are existential themes in this. I think that if we were to classify Chandler's works, you get books like The Big Sleep. That's hard boiled. It's detective fiction. It's got that fresh sharpness in the writing, and it's relatively brief. We're talking closer to 200 pages than 500. This book is the most noirish to me because of the ambiguity, because of the grayness, because of the fact that everybody kind of loses. There are no winners in this book, and even Marlowe, though he does carry his knight's flag pretty confidently through this book, it's so clear he's beaten down. He's wounded by life. He's wounded by his losses. He's wounded by having to experience all of these kind of deadbeat, depressing people, and it's just everything about this book feels world weary, and I guess that makes sense because it did get written, published after World War II, when existentialism was high and our faith in humanity was pretty low
Yeah,
as a species.
yeah, I was just about to mention that, and how frequently that has come up across. That's been an arc of the podcast, is that
Sure.
post World War II bleakness, that especially, and why I found that literature written in the late stages of World War II into the about the mid 50s is so interesting before we have a real shift in the, I guess, the myth making around World War II, really. So yeah, it's interesting to see this. I hadn't even thought about that connection until just you just mentioning it, but a real through line of the works we've explored in the during the show.
Yeah, for sure. Typically, we take a step back after we've talked generally about the book, and we focus on a couple key characters or a couple key aspects we want to explore. Are there anybody? Is there anybody in particular from this book that stands out to you as a character worth spending a little time with?
Well, I mean, we've already touched on Roger Wade. I think as a study of Chandler's works, that's probably the most interesting character because it was, as we've already said, is pretty clearly a stand-in for Chandler himself.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Lennox is in the Lennox and Marlowe relationship is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Even though Lennox really isn't in the book that much.
But his presence is felt from page one to the conclusion. So yeah, he looms larger than his actual time on the page.
Yeah, yeah, which is, I mean, I guess is an interesting course of like Marlowe as a character, that he often has distant relationships with people or momentary relationships during the course of a investigation, but he doesn't, long-standing relationships don't really come up in the work. And here he is like
Mm-hmm.
trying to establish that for himself. And it just doesn't, the truth of the person who Lennox really is just doesn't work for Marlowe.
Yeah, that whole sequence is interesting, and if we were to study this book more academically, in the context of crime fiction, the Marlowe Lennox relationship would be alone worthy of the cost of admission. Just what is this private detective doing with Lennox, and why is this important given what we know about Marlowe, and why did Chandler make this move? I would say that Lennox also kind of has a little bit of Chandler in him too, because of his connection to England. And
Yeah.
I think that Chandler was seeing himself all over this book because he was really, I don't know, seemingly reflecting on his own experience as a failed writer and as a guy who was in his twilight years as an artist and maybe even in life. He didn't live that much longer than this book. And the idea of thinking of this book as a kind of meta narrative about Chandler himself is pretty persuasive when I think of all the ways that I felt that Chandler had inserted himself into this. It's just an impressive piece of work as an item to study, more than one with a riveting hard boiled plot line.
Yeah, and I just briefly, I am absolutely 100% positive that academic papers have been written about the Lennox Marlowe relationship. The other characters in here, like most of them didn't, they don't really jump out at me that much. in part just because they feel, I don't want to say they serve a plot device because that's not really true, but they're a little bit typecast, and we move through them all pretty quickly.
Yeah, there are a lot of tropes in here. We have the uptight doctor. We have the Eileen Wade has a femme fatale quality. She's a seductress. We have some casual racism in here with the
Yes.
Mexican servant candy, and some of the other ways that Mexico and Mexican characters are referenced in this story, or just Spanish speaking characters in general. Nothing like Farewell, My Lovely, which I found to be explicitly and excessively racist. This feels a little more scaled back, so I guess that's good. But yeah, I would say that there are a lot of tropey characters, but I would say that overall, a lot of these characters they don't blur together exactly either. They
No.
He does take enough time to develop Linda Loring as being different from Eileen Wade, as being different from, and Terry and Roger being distinctive, and Spencer, even this publisher, has his own way. He's from New York, and you can just tell that he's not from around there in the same way. I do feel like Chandler was mindful of the characters, even if not a single one of them screams to me like, "Oh yeah, what an excellent, memorable individual."
Yeah, no, that's true. That's a good point. They are distinct. But they ultimately, I guess to me, I guess it feels a little repetitious that that so many of them are like they're throwing Chandler off the trail, or I don't know how many different characters tell him to stop looking for Lennox.
I know.
It's quite a few, and
Yeah,
yeah. So just with that, but you're right. There is more distinction here than I think we see in a lot of the works that we've covered.
for sure. I've never seen a piece of work with so many sad rich people tossed into it, except maybe since the Great Gatsby. But yeah, you could tell that Chandler is these might be the kind of people that he surrounds himself with, and if that's the case, I'd be depressed too.
Yeah, I mean maybe that's an even more a better example of how this is a personal work, and that these are stand-ins for people that Chandler personally knew, or at least versions of them.
Sure, sure, not unlikely.
Yeah, so we've covered a lot of this already, but do you have any other thoughts about the general plot of this book?
I mean, it's convoluted. It comes together in the end. We get the surprise in the last few pages that wasn't much of a surprise. It sort of felt like we were going in that direction. But that might just be because this book's old and it's been revisited in so many ways. And I've seen the movie and I've read it before. So it just didn't, I wasn't shocked. But overall, I'd say there's a lot of good in this book. It's worth spending time with. It does sag in the middle. I think that Chandler handles the material in the best way that he could at that time in his career. And I'm glad we have the book. I think it is an important work and it's worth spending time with. It's worth revisiting once in a while. But it also isn't what I would consider an exemplar of like a taut, hard-boiled crime fiction like that I really love. This is probably the closest piece of writing he wrote to literature, to his attempt to become literary, where his material, his work, sort of transcends the genre and becomes something different.
Mm.
Kind of like how A Flash of Green by MacDonald, a book that I hate, was not a crime book like I thought it would be. It was very domestic and about ecological themes, but it was such a domestic drama, and I hated that book because it didn't elevate the genre. It just was like its own thing, which was a disappointment. Whereas this feels like it challenges and elevates the genre and brings something different to it. Now, I might not love what that thing is, but I do feel like the Marlowe in this book is as fresh and vibrant in terms of his language and the way that he uses dialogue as he ever was. So something about this is special, even if I didn't absolutely love reading all 500 pages of it.
Yeah, and I think that legacy portion is important, and also your comment of like it's hard to be surprised by this fiction, and I think that's because of the
Mm-hmm.
legacy. It's been we talked in
Mm-hmm.
an earlier episode that our probably our first exposure to Chandler-esque fiction was actually children's cartoon spoofs in the 80s, where
Absolutely.
every show had to have a detective that was based on Marlowe, pretty much. Sitcoms do
Mm-hmm.
this. And I was thinking, like, I mean, that's the real legacy that the piece is. I was just replaying for a modern example here. I was replaying the video game Cyberpunk 2077 recently, and there is a Raymond Chandler mission in that game. So this just came out recently, and you can, if you haven't played the game, I'm sure you can go on YouTube and see like a walkthrough of that part of the mission. It's pretty short, but it's called Raymond Chandler or something. I can't remember, but his name is the title of the mission. We still see it spoofed in television shows. Another place where I know I was exposed to Chandler early on was Star Trek: The Next Generation episodes.
Mm-hmm.
That's the real impact of this work. Is anything that gets copied that much is important.
Sure.
I don't know how to state anything more important than the legacy in the it maintains its presence in pop culture, and people will revisit the work.
I will add that even among film adaptations of Marlowe's or Chandler's work, we have The Big Sleep with Humphrey Bogart, which of course is, you know, well regarded, but also one of the later interpretations of this story, 1973's The Long Goodbye, starring Elliot Gould, the Altman, you know, direction. It's a great book. It sort of it rewrites the story in large ways at times, but it captures a grim, world weary Marlowe in the 1970s in a way that breathes new life, a different kind of life into the work, and is considered a very, you know, very successful interpretation of Chandler, and that's not very common to find. These books don't get translated very well into film. Three times out of four, they fail. So this book did get its successful adaptation, and for those who haven't seen it, I highly recommend. Gould as Marlowe playing world weary 1970s PI. And we didn't. I chose not to rewatch it for the sake of this episode, though I had considered it. It might have been a good move for both of us, but that's okay. We'll keep it separate. It's its own thing.
Yeah, no, that's a good reminder. I need to rewatch that one. I mean, we can just look at, I think the most recent adaptation was that just called Marlowe, and that one was not well received. So it is an example of, as you say, it's hard to adapt. As we close out our discussion of The Long Goodbye and move into more of the legacy of the show, I wanted to read, and maybe we don't need to react to this. Maybe we can. This is a paragraph from literary critic Frederick Jameson, who recently passed away. His book,
Yeah, rest in power.
yeah, his book Raymond Chandler: The Detections of Totality. And I forget, I did steal this from some author on Twitter, but because you posted a screenshot, I can't search it, so I have no idea who you are. But you reminded me of this work, and I'm going to read the last paragraph. And this is a little bit about what I was talking about futility and the existentialism of Chandler's work. So, for now, at the end, all the events of the book are seen in a new and depressing light. All that energy and activity wasted to find somebody who had in reality been dead, or maybe in this case alive, for so long, for whom the time of the present was little more than a process of slow physical dissolution. And suddenly, at the thought of that dissolution and of the mindless lack of identity of the missing person so long called by name, the very appearance of life itself, of time in the present, and of the bustling activity of the outside world is stripped away, and we feel in its place the presence of graves beneath the bright sunlight. The present fades to little more than a dusty, once-lived moment which will quickly take its place in the back years of an old newspaper file. And our formal distraction at last serves its fundamental purpose by diverting us from the ritual generic aim of the detection of the criminal and of his transformation into the other. It is able to bring us up short without warning against the reality of death itself, stale death, reaching out to remind the living of its own moldering resting place.
That's very
It's
nice.
well written, but bleak.
Yes.
Very bleak.
Hey, yeah, that's what I was seeking. Bleak and well written. That should have been the name of the podcast the whole time.
That's right, Justin. It was kind of what you and I decided we really liked in this genre.
Which is a nice segue into us talking a little bit, reflecting on our experience with this podcast and kind of bringing some of these reflections to a fitting close.
I think we should talk about that. And if this is your first episode, I'm sorry. If you're a long time listener, thank you so much for listening. I really do mean that. And but I always felt that we needed to come back and do a last episode, if for nobody else than the two of us, to reflect on this project that we did. And I thought it would be good to start out to just give you the briefest of updates of like why we fell away from it, and what we're doing now and what we kind of plan to do in the future. So I don't know, Justin, do you want to talk about that first, or do you want me to?
So yeah, I'll answer this, pass it to you, and we'll just sort of popcorn it back and
Sounds good.
forth with the questions. What I'm doing now is that I've definitely sort of stepped away from reading crime fiction. I've stepped away from reading a lot. I haven't been in a big reading mode since my heart surgery. It just hasn't been where I wanted to spend time. I certainly didn't expect that, but it's what happened. Now, I talked a little bit about this during the Writing Ratface episodes, just how I was spending time in different ways. I picked up a pretty nasty chess habit. It was a way of coping with the existential fear of going into heart surgery, and then it became a nice distraction during the healing process. And I'm not good at chess, but I've gotten out of beginner status, and I'm working my way to cross over into intermediate level play, and it's become a fun thing. And I have goals connected to the practice of playing chess. I have ambitions to get to a certain level, and I think that's consuming me in a certain way right now. That will probably run its course, just like everything I like. I tend to dive into something for a few years and then go, okay, I'm satisfied. That scratched an itch, and now I'm going to go discover something else new. So right now for me, it's chess, deep dealings with school and teaching and all that, of course. Oh, and doing some political stuff. But that's where I've been spending my time. I've also very excited about plays and playwrights all of a sudden, and I think that I want to understand and begin working on some plays. So that's another thing that kind of surprised me over the past few months, and that might be where I spend a little bit of time going forward. Where are you, Kurt, and what are you up to?
Well, life has changed considerably since we began this show. I was thinking back this morning about when I first proposed doing the show with you over I think it was a text message or a Facebook message. I was sitting on the deck of a boat, leaving port. I was off watch, and this idea popped into my head, and I said, "Hey, Justin, should we do this?" And since then, I do have a totally different career. I went back and finished grad school. I moved from working on vessels to working in marine policy as a job. I now work on trying to make the industry I was a part of more sustainable. I'm working on port electrification and new marine fuels, offshore ocean energy. So I'm in energy and maritime in a totally different way, which is great. But it also grad school, and I'm not alone in this, but grad school kind of changed my relationship to reading. I read a ton of PDFs for work. So sitting down with a novel is just not as relaxing as it used to be. I still listen to a ton of audiobooks. So I'm consuming literature. I'm just doing it in a different way. And I realized somewhere along the line that the relationship between the printed written page was substantially important to how we do the work on this show. For me, I need that. I need to hold the book, look at the book, be able to go back and forth with the pages and spend time with the written word in that way. And an audiobook just does, I don't have that same relationship. I enjoy the story and the characters and the plot, but it separates me from a layer of analysis. So that was one of the challenges. And, this is, I guess, not, we may get into this in another question, but I think my energy for a project like this is best served in the future, focusing in on this thing I specialize in, maritime stuff. So I do have ideas for a future project, but it's going to be under that umbrella in the future.
I loved your journey over the past few years because when we started, I was working the same job I'm working now. Your journey has been a little more dramatic, lots more upheaval, lots and ups and downs and switches and changes and life goals and degrees. Like so, yeah, it's been fun to watch that. But you've still kept your identity, the things that you cared about as a heart, at the heart of what you do. But I remember you bringing Charles Williams to me, and he was the fourth episode we did. This idea of maritime noir and this kind of coastal crime stuff that I had, and we never revisited him, and we
did,
should
yeah.
have, but we just didn't get around to it. But I like that you're still carrying the flame of Charles Williams in the work that you do.
Nice way to put it. And yeah, I mean, both of your journey. I mean, yes, you're doing the same job, but you were not a tenured professor at that time. You've achieved tenure. That's really, frankly, hard in the academic environment these days. You've been the chair of your department. You've had this, a big surgical experience that you've gone through. So to be, to kind of share that journey together has been really, really good. And it's also really great that,
Yeah.
part of the reason you and I did this project is because we were friends in college and we stayed in touch, but we didn't have that many reasons to talk to each other regularly. And doing this project really gave us that opportunity, and we've maintained
Yeah.
that for years now. So that's been super positive, and I thank you for
Yeah.
that.
That's been that's one of my biggest fears is that when we stop being forced to have to talk about books together, that we don't talk at all. And I bet that we'll be capable of figuring out a way forward that doesn't lose that thread. And maybe eventually someday we get reinvigorated and decide to come together on something else. But for now, it makes sense to tie this up and then to pursue new
Yeah.
paths because there's only so much life we have to live, and we both have an embarrassing amount of
That's
interests.
that's for sure. Speaking of which, we need to get our role playing game back online, so we'll be spending time together there.
Yeah, my character Ruck is looking to get into some mischief. He's
Yep.
ready.
Another question I had for you, Justin, is there any big takeaways of things that you've learned during the course of doing this show?
Well, I learned in general a lot. I learned how to speak about books in a way that is a little more focused. I learned how to sort of balance subjective reflection with an attempt to objectively or contextualize a piece of writing in a genre. Like, I don't think I know a genre as well now as I know crime fiction, and that's because I haven't ever tried to kind of clinically understand it from start to finish over a course of decades, or even in this case, a couple centuries. So it's been really fun to go. I'm going to document publicly, which is fucking weird,
Yeah.
to document publicly my sort of intellectual journey, knowing, not pretending like I'm some kind of like Mr. Fancy super intellect, but just somebody who has a reasonably interested curiosity about a thing, and will anybody want to be a part of that? Will anybody want to listen to something like that? And the answer is yes. We don't have a billion listeners, but those that have listened and have shared this experience, I like to think that they got something out of it that was meaningful to them, and to be able to share that in a public way with a good friend, it's been fun. It's a different way of looking at teaching, and it's a way that I actually like teaching to be, which is it should be public, it should be collaborative, it should be shared experience, and it's not something that should be hid behind paywalls. It should be accessible for all in the spirit of direct democracy. So I really love that aspect of this process of creating from scratch and then learning how to, through all our ups and downs, do a podcast for regular people who are curious about something that we have a shared interest in. That's one way I could answer that question. There's a million other ways, but I think that's good for now. And I'd love to hear your response as well, Kurt.
No, that is a really good point about making opinion, putting it out there, putting something out into the public, and that is kind of sometimes a scary thing, to be honest, especially with the nature of the
Yeah,
internet. I mean, why I really thank all of the listeners out there who provided us with positive reviews or comments over the years, because those negative ones they kind of hurt sometimes, So like it was great, and one of the reasons I did wanted to do the show was felt this need to finish a project. I had all these ideas, but doing this episode by episode, every time an episode was finished, there was a finished product. And I don't know what my
yeah,
own like legacy exactly will be, but this may be the thing that the most people out there have ever heard from me. And, that's kind of interesting to think about. I like to imagine our listeners, like you said, we don't have a ton of listeners, but they would fill a very large auditorium based on our episode downloads. So I like to think of those people sitting out there, and I wish I had got to meet more of you. And that's something if I could change anything, I would. The other thing is, I think I just learned a lot more about how to do an internet project. I wouldn't necessarily change things that we did, but if I was launching another project, I would think about it a lot differently. I understand why creators especially in the digital space, often start a project and then shift and change it up and do something else, and you never see the whole project because they learned a lesson and shifted. And if I was doing something in the future, I would use what I learned from this show in that space, and hopefully that would be more successful. So
yep. We learned a lot along the way, but it is fun to look back on our episodes from the early days and go, okay, you can actually see the evolution of the things that we cringe about now and go, okay, I see where we went astray on a number of occasions. And yet, I think our heart was in the right place early on, and we were trying to do something that was well balanced. But the thing is, these are organic projects, and they have to respond to organic
yep.
lives and our shifting understanding of the medium. And I think at the end it felt easy. Like this episode's easy to record. It's easy to sort of plan. It's in my DNA now, which is cool. And if I ever did another thing, I would have that with me. I've learned, like kind of like finishing a book. You write a book, you edit it, you make a bunch of mistakes, you put it out there, and you take notes so you don't have to do all that again.
Yeah, absolutely. And if there's any potential creators listening out there, one of the things I would have done differently is I would have done this on YouTube instead of as a podcast. I think the algorithm does indeed help you.
Yeah, good point. I spend so much time on YouTube. It's hilarious because I spend all this money on all these streaming services, and then I sit on YouTube like just downloading free shit all the time. And it's hilarious how much value it has to me. And again, it's the algorithm that keeps drawing things to my
Yeah.
attention.
So before we close out the show, I want to come back to a couple of questions about crime fiction itself. And the next question that I have for both of us is, we talked about our favorite works in episode 50. And I'm curious if with some time and reflection, Justin, your choices have changed at all since then.
I actually sat with the with the podcast run this morning, and I just looked through each one, and I asked myself, which of these books is meaningful to me still, a few years later, and if we're looking at the first 50 episodes, the standouts are largely the same. We have Jim Thompson, The Killer Inside Me. We have Ray Chandler's Big Sleep. We have Goodis, Shoot the Piano Player. I loved that. I still remember specifically where I was, what I was doing when I was reading that book. It was November. I was drinking a whiskey with pinion flavor in it, and it was so fucking good. And that book, I was just like, this is as noir as it gets. And I still have that feeling about that book. Other books, Megan Abbott and Queen Pin, Dorothy Hughes was a big discovery. Horace McCoy, Paco Ignacio Tabo III
Oh
from
yeah.
Mexico City. Such a great read. And then you introduced to me Jean-Claude Izzo and the Mediterranean noir. And then our Hawaiian
Yeah.
noir, when we hung out with Chris McKinney for the first time and read Yaku Doshi, Age of Calamity. I thought that was the coolest book. And some of his other stuff I had high hopes for, and it didn't meet the metric of that book. But man, that book was damn fine. So those were good books from the past. And then on top of that, the episodes since episode 50, we went back to Chester Himes. This was during George Floyd and all that. And I remember the book Run Man Run was incredibly powerful and as hard boiled and just intense as it gets. Howard Brown, who would write detective fiction set in Chicago, and he was writing back in the 1930s, and I was like, who is this dude? And yet he's writing this compelling stuff about my hometown. I thought that was great. A couple others I'll mention before I share it with you. Ed McBain, I was expecting to hate, but I actually liked Cop Hater, and I thought that writing style was really sharp, and it convinced me that police procedurals don't have to make me mad or don't have to be distasteful to me. They can be riveting. And then Margaret Miller, Beast in View. I remember that being a surprising standout read, as well as James Hallis's Drive, which was more recent noir, but it had the same vibe that I seek out in my preferred kind of crime fiction. So those were books that I look back on and go, holy shit! Had we not done this podcast, I might not have read any of these, to be honest.
Well, yeah, Justin, that overview is better than anything I prepared, and I really it is quite a journey of going through the fiction, and I don't think I mean, one of the problems with the show, I think, for longtime listeners, is that you and I tend to agree on most of the fiction that we read. So I can't
Yeah.
really I don't really have much to add to that. I still like there's so many series that a lot of the things I want to do is go back to some of these authors who have 10, 15, 20 books or whatever, and spend some more time with the series that we only covered a couple or one. That's something I really want to do. I think, going back to episode 50, I said my favorite book was They Shoot Horses, Don't They? And it still is.
Mm-hmm.
It's still my favorite one that we've covered.
Wow.
I love that book. I think some other standouts for me, and this one is not crime fiction, but it is, in my definition, noirish, is The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. I think that is one of my favorite books. I really, really enjoyed spending time with Paco Taibo as well. I mean, that I could read that all. I could read his work all the time. And of course, I mean, you've already brought him up, but I gotta love my guy, Charles Williams. I need to finish his catalog because it's not that many books and there's a few things I haven't finished yet. So I want to get back to that. I want to get back to some of these new favorites. But I do think if I want a theme that I want to say was a really good, a thing that I'm really glad that we grabbed and ran with is our global noir take. I loved traveling around the world
Yeah.
to look at the crime fiction of Italy or Nigeria or Japan. That was fascinating. And I mean, these themes in these books are universal. And that's clear in the fiction that exists. And I hope that more and more things continue to be available in translation. I imagine that they will. But if you're a reader who hasn't gone on some of that journey yet, I think that's where the future of crime fiction really is.
That's a good point. And the global noir thing was an incredibly fun journey we took together. I mean, did we do that during the pandemic or not? I'm not sure. It was damn close, but the feeling of it, it did feel like we had a passport and we were just traveling around and investigating the world from our computer, trying to understand how this genre has evolved and grown different kinds of roots in different places. I still have dozens of books that I picked up during that spell that on my shelf that I haven't read yet. Places from Japan, books from Japan, books from Africa, but also other areas. I have a Kingston Noir. I have other books that I hope I get a chance to read. It definitely brings a different kind of a look to the genre and reminds us that internationalism is where it's at.
Yeah, I totally forgot. We did a Brazil episode as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
I think this kind of gets into the question, really the last question I wanted to ask, and that is how we thought our relationships with crime fiction would be moving forward. And it sounds like we've kind of answered that question, but do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah. Briefly, while I'm not reading crime fiction right now, I have a whole bookshelf entirely dedicated to crime fiction. I think about and see crime fiction in all writing. I see the ways that uh, mystery tropes are revisited in all different kinds of genres because at this point it's all one big melding. It's just a stew, and as a writer who loves to think about sort of genre bending and overcoming the narrow confines of formula. I love that I now have in my back pocket a relatively deep and broad knowledge of what crime fiction has and can look like. And it allows me to just be a better analyzer of the world and of literature, but also in my own writing in terms of building structures. Am I always going to write genre fiction? Am I a crime fiction writer per se? No, I didn't start that way. And sure, I've written a few stories that have been published, and I'm working on some crime fiction novels. That's all going to be ongoing. It's the work that I haven't started yet that won't be crime fiction. I know that it too will be informed by it, by what I've learned from these 5 years spending time in deep study with these writers. It's an incredible gift, and it's sort of like getting a degree in this stuff without having to do all the bullshit, all the fun and none of the
That's a
pain.
great way to put it. I totally agree with you on that. It has been an experience, and recording this last episode and talking with you today, I'm honestly missing it. I miss sitting with these works
Yeah.
in the way that we were doing, and I need to get that back in my life. I think. I mean, we at one time I did a rough calculation, and I think for a several year period there, I was reading 2.5 to 3 books a week for this show. And so it's hundreds of crime fiction novels that I got to read because of doing this show, and that like comparing it, as you say, to a degree, like you wouldn't read that much if you were doing a master's degree in this. You do more writing, but
Oh
certainly
yeah.
not as much reading. And it it's been really great. I miss the prose. I miss the insights into society, whether they are a reflection of that moment in time or that place, or a reflection on our current lives. I miss that, and you get that in other pieces of fiction, but there's something about the way that it is done in crime fiction when it is done well that just for me it puts it over the top. It excels in that space. And maybe saying this now, it means I need to pick a book off my shelf I haven't read and do that. And I guess if there's a parting message I have about the show is to pick up those books that you've been waiting to read and read them.
Yeah. I mean, it's as simple as that. Award yourself the time. It's worth it. Sometimes it pays dividends. In the case of us, it was 7 years of working together on a project that was it's a passion project. It was fun. We learned a lot. We spent some quality time together. I'd recommend anybody who has a desire to do something like this to give it a shot. We didn't know what we were doing, but we did it anyway, and I don't have any regrets about that. This has been a lovely experience, and I nostalgically already, yearn to maybe come across some dumb idea and propose it to you, Kurt, in a couple years, and have us revisit, even if it's a short mini series, some kind of project that's similar to this that feeds our interest in the same
Yeah,
way.
that's a good point. And I think just to let folks know, I think one thing we'll do is, I mean, we'll probably shut down our Facebook page about around the show soon. I think we will leave the stream up, so keep your subscription on if you want, and if we have future projects, we'll pop up and announce them. But I'd want to thank all of our listeners.
Yeah.
It was a passion project. It was a project that I mean, at least for me, we did this for ourselves more than anybody else, and thankfully many of you came
Mm-hmm.
along for that ride. And if you listened to one episode or every episode, thank you for that. Thank you for your support, and just thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. And if you liked Cornell Woolrich better than us, then more power to you.
And to end the show and to end the series, I want to quote Chandler, and at the end of the long goodbye, and he uses the French phrase, to say goodbye is to die a little. And the very last line of the book is, I never saw any of them again, except the cops. No way has yet been invented to say goodbye to them. And with that, we'll pull our hats down low and walk out into the cold, wet night. Goodbye.
See you, everybody. Thank you.
Point Blank is under a Creative Commons license. Music is by Justin. Copywritten works are property of their respective holders.